Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hughes. I'm the CTO for Tototheo Maritime. And a big thank you to Capital Link for asking me to host this panel, which I shall promptly introduce. So on my left here, I have Mr. Stephen Cooper, who is the CEO of Fourth Insurance. I then have Mr. Johan Backas, who is the Managing Director for Eniram. Good morning.
Morning. And
last but not least, we have Professor Mikael, who is Research Manager of RISE Viktoria and Chairman of PortCDM. So good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
So I have Mark O'Neill did the very brave thing of not doing preparation for any questions. Sadly, I did think about doing that and putting you on the spot, but I instead opted to give you some questions. Now, the panel we have this morning, we're here to discuss about the cybersecurity, digitalization, and where we're going with that. And there's been a lot of discussion, especially in the last 2 years, about cybersecurity, but what's come to the forefront, at least in the last 12 months, is a lot of discussion about blockchain and cryptocurrency. Now, I'm sure that most of you are aware of Bitcoin, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, Ethereum. And Bitcoin currency, unlike fiat currencies like the euro or the dollar, which are backed up by an economy, cryptocurrency tends to be more backed up with the technology behind it. So there's been a lot of discussion about it, and is it good, and where can we go forward? Now, despite that I'm a CTO and I embrace technology and I love it, I class myself as being a healthy skeptic. And with cryptocurrency, especially in the last 4 months, we've seen the Bitcoin value rise and then dramatically fall. So my first question to all of the panel is basically cryptocurrency. Does it have a place in the maritime industry now? If not, when? And would there be a defining moment where the industry as a whole is going to say, okay, this is what we need to do. We need to use cryptocurrency. So, gentlemen, I don't know which one wants to go first. Stephen, maybe you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Howard. I think we would all agree that cryptocurrency is very much the flavor of the month. And unfortunately, it has often become the solution in search of a problem. And for those owners and managers who feel that they're not spending enough time on collections in fiat currency, then you can encourage your charterers to pay you in cryptocurrency so you can have problems in 2 different forms of payment. And I'm sure that this will occupy much of your time. Whereas crypto may not be a solution to problems that we have now, I think the extension of that, the way that it is record-kept, blockchain, has very, very wide application in maritime, certainly in the way that it can facilitate transactions, help with insuring and transferring risk to third parties. So I would say that probably the defining moment in cryptocurrency will be when you return home and your spouse or partner asks you for some money for the household budget, and the demand is made in Bitcoin rather than currency. So let's wait for that to happen.
Okay. Michael?
I also think that since the maritime sector is a highly distributed ecosystem, it will for sure be something that reminds about this phenomenon coming up. So I think that even though that it might be the fad of the month and so on, I think that it is going to be there. It's going to come.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just about a matter of when it actually will be stable enough to become a currency. I mean, and then shipping, of course, is no different than any other industry. It will, penetrate all our lives sooner or later. But I guess for the moment, we can all see that, the stability of any cryptocurrency is not worth, dealing with today.
So, do you see any form of actual defining moment where it would be, or are we just going to look for a period of stability and say, okay, yep, that's good enough to go with at that point?
I don't know. Maybe if central banks start to issue cryptocurrencies, I guess that would be kind of a defining moment. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. So behind cryptocurrency comes the use of blockchain. Now, blockchain, as just mentioned, has quite a wide variety of applications, and it's growing literally month by month. We're seeing different applications that can be using this. Now, again, being the healthy skeptic, what I've seen in the last few similar events, at least for the last 6 to 8 months, it's been blockchain, 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 blockchain. Everyone's been talking about it. Is blockchain actually going to be this sort of panacea, this cure-all, this ability to solve all our problems, technology-related, or is it going to be only used in certain areas? Do we actually see this as being something that's actually going to really, really pick up within the industry? Anyone want to go first on that one? Stephen?
Well, I don't think that blockchain will cure world hunger or help us find peace in the Middle East. But I think that there are applications for blockchain which have immediate and very positive application. You might be aware of the fact that Maersk, which certainly has made the news, did engage XL Catlin, a major insurer, to develop a private blockchain, and they engaged in a 20-week proof of concept project where XL Catlin obtained extensive information about Maersk vessels, customers, flagging, charterers, routes, expenses, and providers. And with this information, Maersk and XL will collaborate to produce insurance which has pricing which reflects precise levels of risk engaged by Maersk, better pricing, better information, less fraud, and I think that that sort of application of blockchain has immediate applicability, and we will see other collaborations between carriers and vessel owners within the marine industries to very, very positive response with immediate benefit, eventually leading to the attraction of more capital into the markets.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think I want to second that the marine insurance is probably going to be one of the first adopters of blockchain technologies. We're involved as well as a company together with a company from London called Concerus in a project where blockchain will be applied in the marine industry very soon. I would say that within the next 12 months we will see not only Maersk and XL Catlin, but also other entrants in the market applying blockchain. And I think the reason for that is quite simple. Transparency was discussed already in the earlier panels, and that's one of the reasons that we need to have systems that then actually can deal with this transparency in a reliable way. Blockchain will have a lot of various positive effects, for example, on bureaucracy, paperwork that doesn't need to be sent all over the place. And of course, it will be an opportunity to effectivize the whole way of working. I think the marine industry is a very, let's say, traditional industry in that sense. There's a lot of different type of intermediaries, for example, and all of this will be much simplified when we have a reliable blockchain that actually can then that translates what's happening into a untempered ledger in a way.
So you hit on a key point there when you said about the maritime industry being traditional. I've heard the words conservative or reserved being used before. So I'm going to play devil's advocate and say that here we are now talking about blockchain. We have been for the last, let's say, year, 2 years. Are we still going to be talking about blockchain in the next 10 years with limited rollout? Or is that is this something that's going to be adopted so super quickly and set a precedent in terms of the maritime industry? Do we see this as coming quickly or slow, based on the conservative opinion of some?
I think this will come very quickly in certain applications, for example, in the marine insurance. I'm 100% sure of that. Then again, whether it will have other applications, that's another story. But I think, we see that blockchain is coming into banking. It's coming into all of the places where you have a need to specify what's going on and, to make safe transfers. Mm-hmm. So that will happen for sure in the very short term.
Okay. Sorry, Michael, did you want to say something?
I think, personally, we have tried to do some insights or research into blockchains, and I think it must be showing more proof. That's enormously important at this point, where we have a situation where, the Maersk and IBM collaboration, for example, is focusing a lot upon coming to agreement and trust outcomes, but there's a number of different other applications that would be enormously interesting for of applying blockchain technologies, such as, for example, what would we do if we could even so also push, for example, that the port industry has a lot of first come, first served. Mm-hmm. Could we actually blockchain the agreements in such a way so that we can change this whole situation with going towards much more of slot management situation, etc., etc. I think that is a fantastic application if we can come there, but it also needs more proofs of that blockchain actually lives up to what we want.
Okay. So this leads on to my next question, because there was, Johan just mentioned about insurance. So I've got a leading question for Stephen. So when it comes to cyber insurance, let's just say I have a fleet of 200 ships. From an insurance perspective, do I have to have a bespoke policy for each of those ships, or could I have a fleet-wide portfolio policy that would actually cover all of those 200? With that in mind, is there something from an insurer's point of view that has to be mandated in terms of, are you going to say as an insurer that there has to be a certain type of equipment on board, a certain type of UTM or firewall? What's the sort of insurance view on this when it comes to the finer details of protecting against cybersecurity?
Howard, I think that's a great question. We were together a few days ago in Shanghai. You didn't own any ships at that time, and now you have 200. So I would tell you that it must have been a fortuitous
I'll work quickly. Yes, it was very good.
There are about 50 carriers currently competing for market share in cyber insurance. And while there are 50 competitors, unfortunately, at this point, we have very little in the way of standardization among those 50 carriers. So in that instance, almost every policy is bespoke. We find that the cover has different levels of focus. In some cases, the cyber coverage is focusing on extortionate demands, like the NotPetya type of incident that we saw. Other carriers are focusing on broader privacy breach issues. Other policies focus on property damage to overcome the CL380 exclusions in many policies. So to start with, while the policies may not be bespoke, they are significantly differentiated in their templated forms that the carriers are using. But the needs of every owner and every manager are different. I think with any well-crafted approach in the insurance markets to cyber, you will wind up with significant modifications in your policy so that your program as an owner will likely not look like anyone else's. So in that essence, once you take that template, you add the riders and the addenda that you need, you will wind up with something that is very custom tailored, not only in terms of limits and retention, but also to some of the service aspects. Policies vary greatly as to the data security services which are embedded within the policy. So that is another area of differentiation. So we don't see carriers demanding any particular gold standard for systems before they will issue insurance. What they will be looking for is your compliance with the voluntary guidelines put out by many of the trade associations. They will look to see whether you have budgeted for data security precautions, for training of your seafarers. They will look to see if there is a history of any other losses, and those aspects will really figure into rate determination and as to how the markets view your particular company. So we see no specific requirements from a system standpoint. They're looking to see that good fundamental sound management of data is part of your business, and that the management and ownership looks at it seriously.
So what we're still lacking, though, is that sort of standardization from there. So if you're saying about, I've got one ship that has maybe an $80 Netgear router that's got a firewall on it, and I've got another ship with a $15,000 Barracuda UTM sitting on there. If you're doing a bespoke policy for each ship, surely that one would be the higher risk and therefore paying more. So let's say, for example, my 200 ships aren't particularly well standardized in their configuration. Am I going to be paying uneven sort of costs on this based on that? So I would be forced to actually start upgrading all my ships?
Howard, those of you who have looked at cyber applications, you'll find that they are extensive. This will all change once we have blockchain technology, but for the time being, you need to complete 24 to 30 pages of questions. It's absolutely numbing. But if the answer to too many of those questions is, we have an €80 system which is 10 years old, and we have not put the patches on there for the last decade, your premium will reflect that level of carelessness. So I think the markets will encourage you to put in the best types of systems, particularly on communications, and I recommend you call Howard on that.
So while we're talking, excuse me, I'm sorry. While we're talking about this standardization, should there be some form, this is a question for everyone, should there be some form of general regulation towards cybersecurity? And I'm asking that as on a neutral standpoint. If there should, who should actually be responsible for it? Because the threat landscape changes on a monthly, yearly basis. So whoever it is, if it was to be that way, it would have to be very quick. So do we think or do you think, my panel, do you think there is actually any benefit in having this regulated? Because it doesn't exist terrestrially. We're going to fight.
Okay, I say yes. But we also need to distinguish, if you take an OSI model kind of thinking, where you would have technological services, communication services, information services, application services, there are different dimensions and there are different regulation bodies for these kind of services. So it's not a universal cybersecurity thing that is needed. It's more of that the different forums or councils, etc., need to pay attention towards what cybersecurity means for their area of domain.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's no way around it. I think it has to be regulated some way, whether it's more in a form of a guidance or in firm regulation as such. I think that's worth a question. But I think there's no way around it. We have to regulate it some way, because otherwise it's our people who are the biggest risk here anyway when it comes to the whole cybersecurity space, and somehow how should I say, to train ourselves as people. I mean, we're the biggest risk, everybody in this room, It took maybe 40 years for us to embrace safety in the workspace, and we don't have 40 years to embrace, how to work, in a cyber-secure way. So somehow, whether let's put it this way: regulation is one way to aid us on the way, but there needs to be, other actions as well. And I guess that, like was said here, it's up to the companies everywhere in the world to make sure that they have their preventive measures, as good as they can, because that will have implications not only on their insurance policies naturally, but it's a business critical issue that will, in the end of the day, sink companies as well. So we better take it pretty seriously.
To be mildly argumentative, though, from a terrestrial IT perspective, there is no regulation. If we're trying to treat ships as an extension to a centralized office, why have we now got to put regulation in for IT that's on a ship when we don't actually have it in the office? Anyone have a thought on that?
It's a good question. I'm thinking of a good answer. Very good question. Now, like I said, regulation maybe from a point of view of actually aiding us to do a better work in the marine industry. Maybe that's a reason to do it. But like I said, that will not take away the fact that we all, as companies, need to figure out how to secure our own systems, because none of us operate in similar ways. If you think about a vessel or any operation, I guess there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different computer systems that interact with each other, and they're all particular. So whether it's I don't think even this 40-page document, which was mentioned earlier, actually will cover all of those aspects of the risk. So we have to understand best how our companies work, what kind of systems we have. And maybe the regulation then, is a more general way to aid us on the way.
So, based on that, if we get to a point where we can keep our ships regulated, or with a standardized format, you mentioned earlier about, the weakest link being the humans. Before I get to that, because that's actually going to be one of my last questions, what about the ports? Michael? Because if we have a secure ship, it's still going to go to a port. Some of the information that flows to and from ports to ships, even if I've got the best ever cyber system on board that ship, I still pose a risk from there. So this regulation, should it extend to the ports? Because that's now going into the terrestrial IT mentality.
Absolutely, and thanks for the following up question on the last one. I'm sure now, but no.
I'll buy you a beer later.
Yeah. Let's say like this: there does not exist any information without communication, and communication is very much about knowing who is talking, whether I would like to talk to that person, and whether I can trust the information. And what is happening now, and I think that we should be very thankful to the maritime sector, is that that is one party that brought a lot of basis for big data analytics into the situation, where we are, for example, building concepts around that you combine multiple data sources. And that is something that creates or creates a better understanding or a better decision, or I can make better decisions. Is for sure so, and the calculations show that there is a great benefit of being able to synchronize ecosystem in a much better way. We are talking about maybe $25 billion just in fuel savings for shipping companies. We are talking about 12 or half of that in savings for the port operators. So it will be driven somehow, because there are so many business benefits at this point. And me representing the International PortCDM Council, these are aspects that are absolutely brought to the agenda. And then whether that should be regulated or not is of course, a question that we need to think about. But at least guidelines for how to think about these kind of things in the domains, again, that these kind of regulating or guiding bodies are providing.
Okay. because I found it quite interesting that or ironic actually, in that while we're talking about cybersecurity, after receiving my registration pass, like the rest of you, I'm sure some of you saw these in a nice little bowl, which is the USB flash drives, which are often seen as being, if you're from an IT world, they're a savior. Also from an IT security world, they're also a danger because they can contain lots of malicious files. Now, I know that, and I'm sure most of you know that, and I'm sure that all of you, if any of you have picked this up, you'll go home and virus check that first before you put it into your business PC. But that is through education, that I know that. Now, what needs to be done here? Because if we have a system, whatever it is, whether it's on a ship or even whether it's in a port, whichever, there needs to be this user education. Who's actually going to be responsible for getting that education in place, first of all, that a crew member has to be careful what they do with one of these, they have to be careful with what they do with one of these. Who's responsible, and who's actually should be responsible for maintaining that education as time goes on? I can't just buy, here's my firewall. If I put that onto a ship now, it's going to be useless in about a month's time because something new would have come out. Where do we actually continue this? Who's actually responsible for maintaining the education for all, not just crew members, but also for the people who are administering it? Does anyone want to go first on that question? Stephen.
Our observation is that good cybersecurity does not start with your technical people. It starts with ownership. In the case of the public sector, good cybersecurity starts at the board. We've observed with publicly held companies that approximately 60% have taken the initiative of forming a formalized board committee or subcommittee to deal with data security and cyber issues. We think that sets the tone for the company. From the standpoint of good corporate governance, today in publicly released financial disclosures, we find that there is often voluntary disclosure of the steps that have been taken to deal with data security issues. The potential financial loss of a mistake caused by a $3, $2, €1.50. Something like that could cause a cascading loss to many owners, and because of that, we think that boards need to set an example by appointing members who have good backgrounds in data security, who have the authority to seek information from managers about the steps that have been taken. So rather than starting with the seafarer and working your way to the top, we think the effort needs to start with ownership and management, providing the financial resources that are necessary to uniformly throughout an organization promote good data security.
So just going back to one of my earlier questions where we talked about standardization and regulation, could insurance companies start leading the way in terms of what must be done?
I think there's a danger to let the insurers lead the way.
Yes.
I just say that after dealing with them for 45 years. But I would say that they might inspire action. Again, getting back, Howard, to your 200 vessels, if we find that most of them have that $80 of preventive sort of equipment in them, the insurance companies will respond with a very unfavorable rate. And in that case, they will be a good incentive and create some urgency for you to step up your investment and your education within your company. Okay.
So I'm very conscious of time, but I've got one last question that I want to put towards Johan, actually. So in the recent years, we've all seen that satellite operators have increased available bandwidth, which has started opening it up to more applications. One of the big things is talking about telemetry, performance monitoring, proactive maintenance that can be done through this. So my question for Johan is, there's lots of scare stories going around, some true, some not so true, about how someone can access and control a ship. if we're starting to get more of this essential data, what risks are we going to start seeing behind that, and what can actually be put in place to mitigate those risks?
Well, I guess the first risk comes from the communication, satellite communication itself, and I'm sure that the satellite providers, and the service companies there are doing their part in there. But I would say that the data as such is not the problem. It's what the transparency of data is one thing. I guess the question is more about how can, for example, vessels be hijacked, for example, by satellite links. I guess the data itself, can be used and in many different ways. But I guess it's a different problematic when we get to the autonomousness of vessels, and then you have a possibility to actually start manipulating them through the satellite networks or whatever that may be. I think that obviously is a big threat, and we have to take it very seriously. But on the other hand, I mean, let's not forget that maybe the biggest risk today is still the human. I mean, you can do a lot of damage if you're the right person in the right place on board a vessel as well. So it's a mixed picture.
Right, well, I'm afraid my time's up. I did think of a few more questions, but I'll save that for a coffee break. So I'd like to thank my panelists very much for their time, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.